Hello, everybody, and welcome back to day 26 of the 100 Days of Making Comics Challenge. So, today I wanted to talk about the use of thought bubbles in comic storytelling. And this is something that my mom actually brought to my attention because I was letting her read part of my script, and I asked her thoughts on a specific line, and she gave me, some suggestions and stuff. And then she said something that made me go like, "Oh, huh," which is she suggested that I make Tori like think something, and then I realized that I absolutely have no intention of using thought bubbles unless it's absolutely necessary. And so I wanted to talk about thought bubbles as like a literary device, a narrative device, their functions in comic storytelling, and also how they can, like, how they're used, like when they're used and stuff. So I'm gonna start off with my philosophy on my personal use of thought bubbles, because I think that they're a really, really good like tool to use, because comics are a visual medium, but for telling long form nuanced stories, you need to have text. You need to have a more direct and unambiguous way to convey your story to your readers. And that is done through the use of dialogue. And so dialogue is a universal thing when it comes to graphic novels and long form comics. But thought bubbles are not necessary like dialogue is. But it's not like thought bubbles are useless or dumb or shouldn't be there. It's just that my style as a writer is to convey thoughts and subtext and the emotional state of my characters through what isn't said, through the dialogue, or through their body language. And so it's not that I purposefully it's not that I think like thought bubbles are an inferior form of conveying those things. It's just that I come from a prose background, and so I learned writing through through the tutelage of other prose writers, and I did learn the craft of writing with the intention of writing with the intention of eventually publishing novels. And so I definitely, my style of comic of my style of comic scripting is definitely influenced by the rules of, well, not really rules, but the fuck, what is the word? Ugh, it starts with a C. Oh my god, I know it. Conventions. Oh my god, I got it. Is definitely influenced by the conventions of prose writing, and one of those, which everybody knows, is show, don't tell. And so when it comes to thoughts in prose, depending on your point of view, you can do thoughts, but it's kind of frowned upon. Not really frowned upon, but it's more like thoughts should be replaced by something else in order to make it seem more natural. Because if you're doing like a first person point of view narrative or a third person limited, meaning it's told as if the narrator is not the main character, but the narrator only knows what the main character knows, or whichever character they're narrating in that scene knows. So third person limited is is like, I consider it third person first person like so third person limited and first person when it comes to the monologue and the actual prose of the story that is outside dialogue. I treat that as thoughts of the character. So, like when you read or write a story, if you are doing first person or third person limited, you could single out a sentence in your paragraph as a very specific thought that your character has had by like highlighting the whole sentence and then italicizing it. And but the thing is that it's not necessary to do that. It kind of takes the reader out of the head of your narrating character, because technically everything outside of dialogue is the character's thoughts when in those two specific point of views. So I learned script writing and writing with those principles of show don't tell in prose writing. So when it comes to comic writing, I know that thought bubbles are way more common, way more accepted as a form of conveying information, because it's a visual medium, and only at most half of the content of a comic or graphic novel will be text. And I say at most because usually, you don't want your comic to be more than like half text, because at that point you're just doing like a very illustrated novel. You want your pictures to tell most of the story, depending on what information you're trying to convey in a specific panel. But so when you have limited use of prose in comics, obviously you're going to try to come up with something in order to get directly into the thoughts of a character that is kind of taken for granted in prose writing, because in prose writing it's all writing, and if you're in first person or third person limited, all of that writing that isn't dialogue is technically the thoughts of the character, because the point of view means that you're experiencing the story through the head of whichever character you're following. If it's first person and there's only one point of view character, like throughout the whole story, like in Harry Potter, then you're experiencing the story through only like Harry's head, and so his prose is his thoughts. But you don't get that in comics, and so I am not knocking thought bubbles whatsoever. But for me, the way that I write a script means that I just never include thought bubbles, because if I wanted to write a thought that a character has, my first instinct is to make the character make a panel where the character's body language or facial expression shows their thoughts. And that's just from years of creative writing instruction about, instead of saying, I'm sad, you say, like, whatever kind of prose sentence where it conveys that they're sad without actually saying it, or like, he was mad. Instead, you say, like, he crossed his arms with a scowl. And it's like, the thought bubble when it comes to comics is the sentence, he was mad, in my eyes. So I just never find it necessary to do thought bubbles. Though I think that when someone else is writing a script for a comic, maybe their writing style isn't so entrenched in subtext as mine is, and so they'll find that thought bubbles are way more useful than they are for me. And so yeah, like, it's just something I think in comics that isn't really talked about. I don't know, maybe it's just that I haven't, like, come across anyone that has talked about it, but everybody talks about, like, dialogue, and everybody talks about paneling, and like the art that goes into it and all of that, in conjunction with talking about the overall storytelling narrative techniques of comics. But I think maybe a lot of people just lump thought bubbles in with dialogue, but really they're not the same tool, because dialogue, speech bubbles are necessary, but thought bubbles aren't. And so that means that a thought bubble's uses in a comic become different. It becomes much more of like a spotlight on a specific emotion or thought or piece of information, because it's the writers going out of their way to make it a thought. And yeah, and then just to like end this little topic, me TED talking about thought bubbles to you, I wanted to talk about how, because thought bubbles aren't necessary and because they kind of act like a spotlight, if you haven't used thought bubbles before, then suddenly pulling out a thought bubble is like, whoa. It kind of makes it feel like it's coming out of left field. So when my mother suggested I have her think something, I was like, oh, and then I realized that I actually couldn't do that, even if I wanted to, or at least, now, here's the thing, I could do it if I wanted to. I could do anything if I wanted to, but I don't think it would be a good idea to do it, because I hadn't used thought bubbles at all for the first bit of the story, up until the point that she was reading. And that's like a long time to go without using thought bubbles, especially since it's the beginning of the story. And so pulling out a single thought bubble in, the first, like 26 pages or whatever, it's like, that's weird. I haven't seen it. It's like, you don't think about the absence of thought bubbles, and you don't think about the presence of thought bubbles until they show up suddenly. well, really, you don't think about the absence of thought bubbles until well into a story, and suddenly you see one, and you're like, oh, that's a thought bubble. And now I'm realizing that the author hasn't used thought bubbles once since before this. That's strange. And then it's like you don't notice their absence until they're used, and then they are stopped being used for a long time, and then they're used again. So it's like, I guess a little tip then that I would, like a little bit of advice I would give is that thought bubbles are something that should be planned if you want to use them. Like if your comic uses them, you should use them from the beginning, and then um, continue to use them consistently, which is the thing. So I'm not going to say frequently because that's not really the same thing as consistency. If you use a thought bubble in the first like 3 pages and then you wait 10 pages and you just so happen to have a 10-page gap between the next thought bubble, then that's technically infrequent. But if you continue to do large gaps between thought bubbles like that, then that's consistent. Your readers will not find anything strange about it, which is really the thing, is like when it comes to creating a comic, you have to seamlessly integrate the not contradictory, but incongruent mediums of writing and art into a single cohesive thing. And that's done pretty well just by the fact that readers, when they pick up a comic, expect to have text and visuals at once, and so it's like half the battle is already done when it comes to making it cohesive in the reader's mind. But thought bubbles are definitely something that can make a reader unimmersed for a second. It's kind of like when you're watching a movie and in like a movie theater or something, or like in your own home, and you're like really into it, and then suddenly you realize that you're staring at a screen and you're very aware of like your peripheral surroundings, and it takes a bit to get back into that immersiveness where when you're watching the movie, it seems like the movie is in your entire visual space. Like there is no periphery anymore, even though that's not true. It's just your brain blocking it out and really only focusing on the screen. So I feel like thought bubbles, if they're used, if they're not used and then suddenly are used, I feel like they do the same thing where it's like, oh, suddenly your reader isn't isn't like consumed by the screen of your story, and now they're noticing the peripherals, they're noticing the meta of comic making. They're like, oh, that's a thought bubble, and now they're thinking about the technicalities of comics. It's like, I don't know, it's like kind of hard to explain. And maybe this is just like a very personal view, meaning that no one else thinks like this except me, because I actually can never know how other people think about things unless they tell me, or unless it's like a statistic. This is how many people who read comics think about this aspect of comic making. And I'm like, oh, okay, so this is something that's like universal to comic reading or comic making, and isn't just a particular quirk I have when I'm reading. So, yeah, that's just my thoughts on thoughts. This, I'm gonna say that this topic really came out of nowhere as well, for me today, because I sat here for a minute or two thinking about what I would write, and that conversation with my mom just popped in my head, and I was like, that's something to talk about, and that's something that isn't often talked about. So I would like to hear any of y'all's thoughts on thoughts. That's very clever. I think maybe I'll make that the thumbnail title or something. Okay, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.